Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the third chapter in the book of Philippians, and we actually have a lot to cover here, so we're going to reduce our customarily lengthier preamble to the bare essentials. Philippi was a city in Macedonia, which represents the earliest spread of Christianity to the European continent, and Paul was personally responsible for the founding of it. We can read of this in Acts 16, where it was a city just large enough to hold a Jewish synagogue, and there's a wealthy tradeswoman by the name of Lydia who is his first convert, and from there it grows, and they encounter opposition onto imprisonment, but they are liberated from the prison. Paul and his traveling companion, it might have been either Barnabas or Silas, a dramatic prison escape which causes their prison guard to loathe for his life, and they use the moment of his all-time down and dejectedness to lift him up and rise him up as a convert to the faith they proclaimed, which landed them in the prison in the first place. And this was written some 12 years after the fact. It would have been around 62 to 65 that he would have found himself in a Roman prison for the first time. Paul was in prisons throughout the Roman Empire, but this was the site from which he wrote the prison epistles, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, so named in reference to the origin of their location. And Paul, these are some of his more mature writings, and there's something almost systematic in a lot of them. And the Philippian assembly, he has nothing but positive praise to give them because they had comforted him in his chains by sending him a gift, of which we read beginning in the 10th verse of the next chapter. But we're going to open with the opening verse of the third chapter, which reads, "For the rest, my brothers, rejoice in Yahweh. To write the same to you is truly no trouble on me, and for you it is safe." So even though he's in jail, in prison, in chains, he always has cause and reason to rejoice in Yahweh. And when one is truly abiding in him, there's a joy which transcends circumstance. Whether abased or abound, we also read in this book, Paul learned to expose himself to the full richness of a dynamic relationship with the living and loving Elohim, and he's expressing no difficulty or challenge or controversy in writing to them. These are people he held in affectionate enough regard to comfort them even while he was in the midst of his trials and in prison of all places. And look out for dogs, look out for the evil workers, look out for the mutilation. So in this specific context, he reverses the formula according to which Gentiles referred to as Jews referred to Gentiles as dog in the common vernacular in those days. And we can read of this in Mark 9 of a woman outside of the lost sheep of Israel to whom the Messiah was sent, and she long story short, the Messiah asked, "Why should I expend blessings to those?" And the dogs, he actually reflects the nomenclature, and she answers, "Even dogs are content to eat the scraps off the children of the table." But here the mutilation would have been circumcision, so he would have been turning the tides on the traditional direction of who was worthy of the appellation dogs on the Jews themselves. "For we are in the circumcision, who are serving in Elohim, and in the Ruah, in the Spirit, and boasting in Messiah Yahshua, and do not trust in the flesh." Now, circumcision is in some sense in trusting the flesh, in that it's mistaken for a mark of righteousness and a seal of salvation just for having undergone the ceremony. A lot of Jews throughout history have thought they've been automatically and unconditionally saved by sheer proximity of their lineage, but the path to salvation is more complex than circumcision alone. And as Paul explains in this verse, that the inner character is more important. The genitalia does not form the mark or measure of a disciple. It is in the heart alone, circumcision of the heart, which truly matters, and that would detach one from the fleshly observances, which circumcision was, and it would de-emphasize its priority. Though I too might have trust in the flesh, if anyone thinks to trust in the flesh, I more. So he's prefacing a biographical element in this story. He's going to tell his story of how he came to Christianity from Judaism, and as we read, he was a zealous and somewhat extreme Jew, and that extremism certainly carried over into his Christianity. That was one of the litany of the complaints against him by the Christian community. A lot of people thought he was too extreme in his doctrines, particularly the accommodations he was willing to make to the Gentile converts who had since then displaced the Jews as the majority adherents of the new faith. Circumcised the 8th day, of the race of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, according to Torah, a Pharisee. So the 8th day would have been the customary mark where the Jewish male infant was introduced in the covenant community on that day. He would be circumcised and given his name, and he was from the tribe of Benjamin, which would have been linked in the kingdom of Judah, so he wouldn't have been of the lost tribes of the north, but he was a Hebrew amongst Hebrews, so he was a little more Hebrew than your average Hebrew, and he was a Pharisee, which was the strictest sect as measured by legalistic observances of injunctions that were largely self-created, but were somewhat derived from the law, the Torah. According to ardor, persecuting the assembly, according to righteousness that is in the law, having become blameless. So his extremist enthusiasm and zeal, he was ardent in the defense of the traditions of his ancestors, so much so that he was willing to inflict violence among people who he considered heretics and subverters of the traditions of his ancestor. And as we read, he learns to trust a higher, more reliable measure of righteousness than merely following the law. And so he wasn't truly blameless, he only thought he was. But what might have been a gain to me, I have counted as loss because of Messiah. So he illustrates the post-conversion mentality where the things of the old life are no longer consequential, no longer matter, no longer carry the same salience and value as the items of the new faith, which are incomparable spiritual treasures. But I personally came from reprobate. I wasn't raised in a Christian home background, so when I say the things I used to value, they would have been a lot more abominable than the things that Paul values. Paul's only mistake was in elevating their salvific significance. And it's because of the Messiah, when he enters into our life, he becomes our everything, and he transcends any circumstance and enemy that we might confront on the path of following him. What is more, I even count all to be lost because of the excellence of the knowledge of Messiah, Yahshua, Master, for whom I have suffered the loss of all, and count them as refuse, in order to gain Messiah. Now, the word refuse is alternately translated as dung or excrement, so that just goes to show how little he valued the righteousness he thought he once had by the law, because as we're going to read, there is no such thing as self-righteousness. It is wholly and completely 100% attached to his righteousness, who he imputes to our account, and this enables our salvation at the judgment. But again, there's really the what once was treasured and esteemed, and this reminds us of Luke 6:15, that which is highly esteemed among men is an abomination before the Father. and be found in him, not having my own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which through faith in Messiah, the righteousness which is from Elohim, on the basis of faith. So faith by righteousness, the concept was embedded in Habakkuk 2:4, and Paul quotes him twice, in Romans 1:17, the just shall live by faith, and also Galatians 3:13, and the author of Hebrews also reiterates it in the 10th chapter, 38th verse of that book. But the righteousness by faith, there's a lot of trials which test our faith, and by weathering the storm and maintaining the faith is how we maintain righteousness, which is of more value than the mere observance of mechanical and measurable deeds. The righteousness of faith cannot be measured in the same way. It cannot be quantified, but its quality is 100% superior to that which comes by observance of the law, which cannot justify anyone. All it does is expose their sin and reveal their need to the salvation. So Paul, somewhere in the book of Galatians, likens the law's function to a schoolmaster, and that it was necessary for the nation of Israel in their comparative state of spiritual immaturity to have that foundation in order to embrace the true righteousness which can come from him and come alone. Tragically, the majority of them neglected to heed that offer, but we do read that the end times conversion of the Jews is something which you can bet your bottom dollar is bound to happen. To know him in the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. Now, the Greek original know entails experiential knowledge, so to know him is to know him and not just know about him. It entails a more dimensional aspect than abstract conceptual knowledge about his life or his attributes. It really entails a dynamic, active relationship with the living and loving God in the form of his Son. And through that knowledge, we may access the power of his resurrection. We can experience a foretaste of eternity in the here and now, and have some reliable sense of assurance for our standing in salvation. And the fellowship of his suffering, now at this time, the fellowship of the suffering not only is the living community of human Christians, but also involves the Son himself, as he made plain to Paul while converting him on the road to Damascus. In Acts 9:4, he reads, "Why do you persecute me?" Paul thought he was only persecuting his church, his assembly, but he learned firsthand that he does enter into the pains of his followers. And so there is a fellowship of suffering. Suffering tends to isolate the sufferer and make them feel like they're all alone. No one knows what they're going through. No one's possibly experiencing the amount of pain they are in the grips of at the moment. But when we know that he suffers with us, him who suffered for us also suffers with us, what a difference that makes. And as a result of embracing the path of suffering and privation, we become conformed to his likeness or conformed to his death, and through that death we paradoxically gain life. If someone I might attain to the resurrection out of the dead, not that I have already received or been perfected, but I press on to lay hold of that for which Messiah Yahshua has also laid hold of me. So he's cognizant, he's aware that he is not yet perfected, but he is in the process of perfection. His career in ministry indicates a consistent following. Even his there was something almost admirable in his pre-conversion consistency and enthusiasm for Judaism. But Paul was in it for the long run. He endured more than most of us, any of us will ever be called to endure. He was whipped and lashed. He was imprisoned. He was stoned to death on one occasion, and that's where he experienced the power of the resurrection. Not the ultimate resurrection, but the same one that Lazarus experienced. Brothers, I do not count myself to have laid hold of it yet, but only this, forgetting what is behind and reaching out for what lies ahead. So Paul, we can infer from this passage, was not haunted by his path. He had forgiven himself, and he knew that he had been forgiven for it, because there is no such thing as any sinner who's too depraved for redemption. There's theoretically unlimited redemptive potential in each and all of us. And he's also aware that he doesn't even, the mystery of it all, of the greater prizes which awaits him. He's had a foretaste of many of these privileges and pleasures on earth. He was entrusted to hitherto mysterious doctrines, but he was always moving forward, and he didn't let his past haunt him while he was en route to his eternal destination. I press on towards the goal for the prize of the high calling of Elohim in Messiah Yahshua. This high calling can be none other than eternal exaltation and eternal life in the presence and fellowship of the Father and the Son, and it demands of us that we press forward. So we cannot stop and take vacations from our Christian life. It is a marathon, not a sprint. It's a 365 a year, 24/7 gig. And if we are consistent in our maintenance of it, then we can have a similar assurance that Paul did. As many then as are perfect should have this mind, and if you think differently in any respect, Elohim shall also reveal this to you. So any mystery or question or confusion can be addressed to Elohim in prayer, and he will reveal every righteous request. It is commensurate with his will that we know more of him and take our doubts and dilemmas to him in open and honest confession before him in prayer. This is what we witness in Habakkuk. It's better to doubt out loud than to harbor unbelief in silence, because when we do that, our doubt consumes us, whereas if we express it and give it an outlet, we can find the answer which will resolve the doubt. But what we have attained, walk by the same rule, be of the same mind. So the unity is of paramount concern for Paul, whether it be the sources of unity, the same Spirit, same baptism, same assembly, etc., or the singleness of mind. This was reference to the original apostles and their post-Pentecostal community. They held all things in common and were of the same mind in the same places. So what a power that is. We become more than the sums of our own part when everyone is there for the same purpose and doing the same thing and for the same cause. Become joint imitators of me, brothers, and regard those who so walk, as you have us for a pattern. Now we have to understand that while the New Testament was being composed, it had yet to be compiled and would not be done so until some decades after they had been compiled. So the earliest Christians had no such thing as the New Testament, at least the earliest ones. So it is the emphasis on the example of the minister that he sets for his flock is elevated in proportion. And Paul speaks of this frequently in places throughout the Thessalonians in both of them, and also in Galatians 3:12 and 1 Corinthians 11:1 when he says, be imitators of me inasmuch as I imitate the Messiah. So in other words, see the Messiah in him and hold safe to that as your reliable guide. If Paul would err or stumble, and he was human, he was sinful, and he openly confessed his struggle with it in places such as the 7th chapter in the book of Romans. But inasmuch as he does follow and mimic and emulate the Messiah, so too must they him. And he was practicing what he preached. He was willing to suffer for the cause in order to advance it. And there's really a remarkable attitude in the 12th through 17th verse of the first chapter, or somewhere thereabouts or in between, where he expresses an indifference to the means and motives, and he actually expresses joy that the fact that the good news is being spread by him in his chains and outside of him by men of dubious motives, perhaps, but he was indifferent to the motives of the messenger. He was always and only about the spread of the message. For many of whom I have often told you, and now say to you even weeping, walking as enemies of the cross of Messiah. So the cross, it invokes a confrontation, the mere concept of it, and the sight would have been more vivid in the first century audience. The cross was an instrument of excruciating torture and capital punishment used to punish the enemies of Rome. Paul would not experience it because he was a Roman citizen, and as such, he could not be subjected to it. It was reserved exclusively. It wasn't the common procedure for implementing even the death penalty. It was really reserved for only the traitors of Rome, and most of them were, of course, outside the ranks of citizenship. Their end is destruction. Their mighty one is their stomach, and their esteem is their shame. They mind the earthly. So intending and minding and valuing and prioritizing the earth, it does not end well. It in fact ends in destruction, which is death, and that is the result of letting your carnal appetites, including but not limited to those of the stomach, guide and govern your orientations in your daily life. And to be proud in their shame is just a rare species of depravity. Most sinners seek to conceal their sin. Only the most depraved among them actually brag about it and actually are proud of it. It's just foreign to my mind, at least. For our citizenship is in the heavens, from which we also eagerly await this for the Savior, the Master Yahshua, Messiah. So even while on earth, the assembly itself has no ties to any nation. It is comprised of citizens of many nations, but the one citizenship we do hold in common, at least among the authentic flock, is our citizenship in heaven, and our work for the kingdom ought to, by right, exceed the passion and enthusiasm that we do have for the cause of our nations, although I'm personally of the opinion that America's secret to success was her enthusiasm for Christianity, which is slipping away almost by the hour every day. But that's ultimately a side discussion. I am secure in my citizenship in heaven. Nowhere is it written that the American empire will last forever. But if our citizenship is in heaven, then we have the eternal assurance of a sacred solitude and serenity, and eternal at that. Who shall change our lowly bodies to be conformed to his esteemed body, according to the workings by which he is able even to bring all under his control. So this ties into the perfection verses in verse 15. So when we are resurrected, we will receive perfect bodies. The description in the physical functions of it remain, or the physical frame of it remain mysterious for the present time. But we do know that it is designed to endure for an eternity, whereas our frail bodies of skin and bone are destined to decay and perish in accordance to the laws of physics and the laws of fate of nature. But through one who created everything and is able to bring it under his control, and on that last and final day, the cosmos will return to the complete control of its rightful owner, its creator. And if we are lucky, we will experience the sweet taste of the resurrection and salvation. So I do hope to see you there, and maybe now in between we can keep the lessons going. So I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.